You think Mesopotamia was just temples and laws. But do you know what its priests were doing behind sacred doors? To most of us, the ancient land between the rivers is remembered as the cradle of civilization, the birthplace of writing, the home of Hammurabi's code, the place where towering ziggurats rose toward the heavens. Mesopotamian priests are often portrayed as guardians of divine order, solemn figures who kept the gods appeased and the cities secure. It is an image of holiness, of piety, of civilization's first moral leaders. But what if this noble vision conceals secrets etched into clay tablets that few dared to reveal? Beneath the polished myth of divine order, Mesopotamia's temples were also theaters of forbidden rituals. The same priests who recited hymns to the gods oversaw practices that blurred worship with sexuality, devotion with exploitation. Fertility rites celebrated in the name of Ishtar and Inanna transformed intimacy into spectacle, legitimized as sacred duty. Women and men dedicated to temple service were not always exalted servants of the divine. Often they were compelled into roles where their bodies became offerings. What appeared to be holy ritual was, at times, institutionalized control, a merging of faith, politics, and sexuality that would scandalize later generations. The clay tablets speak with unsettling clarity. In hymns and contracts, they record unions staged as cosmic necessity, performances where intimacy was not private, but public proof of divine favor. Priests acted as orchestrators, cloaking forbidden acts in the language of worship. The lines between devotion and domination dissolved, leaving rituals that were at once sacred and shocking. For the people of Mesopotamia, these practices were part of survival, tied to fertility, harvest, and prosperity. But for us, they raise disturbing questions about how civilization's first holy men wielded their power. So we must ask, how? Could the same priesthood that mediated law and morality also preside over ceremonies that treated human bodies as tools of cosmic theater? How could guardians of the divine turn worship into a veil for exploitation? The answers lie not in myth, but in the very tablets that preserved their secrets. And to uncover them, we must first dismantle the illusion of temple purity that history has long upheld. When we imagine Mesopotamian temples, we see soaring ziggurats glowing in the sun, priests in spotless robes, incense curling into the heavens. The temples are remembered as sanctuaries of order, morality, and divine connection. For centuries, historians painted them as the heart of civilization, places where gods and humans met in harmony, where priests carried the heavy burden of maintaining balance between heaven and earth. This is the myth of temple purity. The idea that Mesopotamia's religious institutions were untouched by corruption, elevated above earthly desire. The myth endures because it is comforting. It allows us to see the cradle of civilization as a beacon of progress. Kings issued laws in the temple's shadow. Priests performed sacrifices to protect the people from famine and flood. Temples were banks, schools, archives, and places of worship all at once. In this telling, the priesthood was not only spiritual, but moral, the foundation of justice itself. The image of Mesopotamia as a world guided by divine purity became deeply entrenched in popular imagination. Yet the clay tablets tell a very different story. Buried alongside records of grain taxes and royal decrees are hymns that describe fertility, rites in startlingly candid terms. Priests did not simply pray for abundance, they orchestrated rituals where sexuality was woven into devotion. In the cults of Inanna and Ishtar, goddess of love and war, temple service often included acts of intimacy framed as sacred offerings. Later chroniclers, from Babylonia to Assyria, edited or erased these practices, embarrassed by their explicitness, but the Sumerian and Akkadian sources remain clear. The temples were not only houses of prayer, but also houses of forbidden performance. The myth of purity also hides the darker side of sacred prostitution. Scholars now debate the extent, but tablets describe women, sometimes called Nadatu or Kadishtu, bound to temples as living symbols of the goddess. Officially, they were exalted servants. In reality, many were stripped of family ties and compelled into roles that blurred worship with sexual service. Men, too, were drawn into these roles, including gender-fluid attendants who took part in rituals honoring Inanna's shifting powers. These practices were justified as divine mysteries, but they also reveal how the priesthood used ritual to extend its control over bodies as well as souls. To preserve their authority, priests cloaked these acts in language of cosmic necessity. Sexual rites were said to ensure fertility of the land, renewal of life, and favor of the gods. By framing intimacy as ritual obligation, the priesthood transformed what might be condemned as scandal into unquestionable duty. Worshippers, fearing famine or divine wrath, accepted these rites as essential, never daring to challenge the sanctity of the temple. In this way, power disguised itself as purity, and exploitation became tradition. Later civilizations understood the danger of these revelations. Babylonians celebrated Ishtar as goddess of love and war, but sanitized her cult, minimizing its explicit elements. Assyrians emphasized martial power and divine conquest, but downplayed the sexual aspects of ritual. Even early Western scholars suppressed translations of erotic hymns, preferring to maintain the image of Mesopotamia as a dignified cradle of order. The myth of purity was easier to teach, easier to admire, and far less unsettling than the truth hidden in clay. This contrast between the shining image of temples and the disturbing reality of their rituals is central to understanding Mesopotamian priesthood. To grasp the depth of their power, we must accept that the same hands which lifted prayers to the gods also orchestrated ceremonies of forbidden intimacy. The temples may have stood as monuments of purity, but their walls hid practices that blurred worship with control, and it is here, behind those walls, that the priesthood's most shocking role emerges: the institutionalization of sexuality as power. To understand the hidden power of Mesopotamian priesthood, we must look at how sexuality itself was transformed into an institution. The priests were not only guardians of temples, they were architects of systems where intimacy became ritual and ritual became authority. Sacred sexuality was not an occasional practice or fringe belief. It was embedded into the structure of Mesopotamian religion, recorded in clay, and enforced through temple hierarchy. In these rites, power was exercised not only over the land and its resources, but over human bodies themselves. At the heart of this system were the temples of Inanna and Ishtar. These goddesses embodied both love and war, fertility and destruction. To serve them, priests and priestesses created rituals that merged devotion with sexuality. Women dedicated to the goddess, known by terms such as Nadatu, Kadishtu, or holy women, were central figures. Officially, they were honored as exalted servants, but their service often included sexual rites with patrons, foreigners, or even kings, framed as offerings to the goddess. In reality, these women became both symbols and instruments of power, their bodies used to channel divine favor and sustain temple authority. Clay tablets confirm that such acts were not hidden scandals, but recorded duties. Contracts survive that, describe transactions between temple women and men, overseen and sanctioned by priests. Payments of silver, barley, or livestock were often listed, suggesting that sexual service in the temple was institutionalized, normalized, and justified as part of divine worship. What today we might call exploitation was, in Mesopotamia, codified as sacred economy. By turning sexuality into ritualized commerce, the priesthood tied intimate acts directly to the survival of temples and cities. The priests themselves benefited most. As intermediaries, they controlled access to the divine. They dictated who participated in rites, who could approach the sacred servants, and how offerings were distributed. Every act of intimacy, whether voluntary or coerced, reinforced the authority of the temple. Worshippers believed that by engaging in these rituals, they were securing fertility for their crops, protection for their families, and favor from the gods. The priesthood thus converted private human desire into public obligation, ensuring that devotion was expressed not only through prayer, but through the body. The practice extended beyond women. Men too played roles in these systems. Some served as sacred prostitutes in the name of Ishtar, participating in rituals that blurred conventional gender lines. Others acted in symbolic dramas where kings or priests took on the role of divine consorts. Hymns describe unions between the goddess and her chosen representative, performed by men who embodied her mortal lovers. These acts, presented as cosmic unions, placed sexuality at the very heart of kingship and priesthood alike. The power of these rituals was not merely physical, but psychological. By framing intimacy as divine necessity, the priesthood ensured compliance. No worshipper dared to challenge the system when refusal meant risking famine, disease, or divine wrath. Fear and faith combined to create an unbreakable structure where sacred sexuality could be practiced openly, yet shielded from criticism. The rituals became both proof of devotion and instruments of control, binding the community together under priestly oversight. To outside observers, these practices appeared scandalous. Later cultures, including the Greeks and Hebrews, condemned Mesopotamian sacred sexuality, describing the temples as places of corruption and immorality. But these condemnations, while moralizing, also testify to how deeply embedded the practices had been. They reveal that Mesopotamian priests had succeeded in institutionalizing sexuality so thoroughly that outsiders could not distinguish faith from exploitation. Yet even within Mesopotamia, there was tension. Some hymns celebrate temple unions as holy mysteries, while others hint at unease. The dual identity of sacred servants, exalted in name yet controlled in practice, reveals an undercurrent of conflict. Were they honored as priestesses or used as commodities? The ambiguity itself reflects the genius of priestly power. By cloaking exploitation in divine symbolism, the system could never be openly challenged. This is the essence of sacred sexuality as power. It was not simply ritualized intimacy, it was a structure that tied human bodies to divine will, temple wealth, and political legitimacy. Kings proved their right to rule through sexual unions sanctified by priests. Temples enriched themselves by managing offerings tied to ritualized acts. Communities submitted to systems where their most private expressions became public obligations. And through it all, the priesthood expanded its authority, shaping not only belief, but behavior. The myth of pure worship dissolves in the face of this reality. What looked like piety was also performance. What appeared holy was also transactional. Mesopotamian priests built their influence not only on hymns and sacrifices, but on the ability to turn desire into duty, and duty into control. But if sacred sexuality was the foundation of priestly power, what happened behind the sealed doors of the temples reveals an even darker layer, rituals so shocking that later civilizations tried to erase them entirely. The image of Mesopotamian temples as serene sanctuaries collapses when we step behind their walls. There, hidden from public eyes but preserved in hymns, contracts, and fragments of cuneiform, were rituals that shocked later generations into silence. These ceremonies were not whispered rumors. They were part of the religious calendar, enacted by priests, priestesses, and temple attendants. And what they reveal is a world where sexuality was not private but ritualized, displayed and sanctified in ways that blur the boundary between worship and exploitation. Some of the most disturbing accounts come from rituals dedicated to Inanna, later known as Ishtar. As goddess of love, war, and fertility, she demanded ceremonies that embodied her chaotic duality. Hymns describe processions where worshippers carried symbols of fertility, plows, seeds, loaves of bread, into the temple, only to witness their metaphors played out in explicit acts. Clay tablets recount kings and priests enacting the goddess's union with mortals, their roles sanctified as cosmic theatre. These performances were not private encounters, but staged ceremonies, sometimes observed by attendants who recorded them as proof of legitimacy. The king's virility became a public demonstration, ensuring that his rule carried divine approval. But kings were not the only participants. Within the temple hierarchy, men and women alike were drawn into roles as sacred surrogates. Some were initiated through ceremonies that required them to embody Inanna's power. Priestesses compelled to serve as her vessel, young attendants, dressed in gender-fluid garments, to mirror the goddess's shifting identity. Foreign chroniclers later accused Mesopotamian temples of harboring male brides of Ishtar, attendants who blurred conventional roles in service of the goddess. Whether exaggerated or not, the consistency of these reports across cultures suggests that cross-gendered performances were indeed part of ritual practice. Other texts hint at fertility festivals, where group rites were staged to ensure prosperity. Attendants describe food, drink, and sexualized dramas woven together, transforming abundance into a spectacle of devotion. These were not spontaneous acts, but choreographed ceremonies, written into liturgy, enforced by priests who claimed the gods demanded them. For the participants, refusal was unthinkable. To deny the ritual was to defy the goddess herself, a risk too great in a society that believed famine, disease, or divine wrath could follow. The darker side of these rituals lies in the lack of choice. Women dedicated to temples were bound by vows, stripped of family life, and given wholly to divine service. Hymns may celebrate them as brides of the god, but their individuality was erased in the process. Their bodies became stages upon which cosmic dramas were performed, their consent assumed by the authority of priests. Even when celebrated as honored servants, they were controlled as instruments of ritual. The conspiratorial undertones grow stronger when we consider how much of this was later hidden. Babylonians and Assyrians preserved Mesopotamian myths, but softened the rituals, rewriting Inanna as Ishtar while erasing her most explicit ceremonies. Greek and Hebrew accounts condemn the temples as dens of immorality, but their outrage confirms that such practices once existed. Modern scholars, too, hesitated to publish the most explicit tablets, storing them in archives rather than risking scandal. For centuries, the forbidden rituals remained buried not only in ruins, but in silence. So were these acts genuine expressions of faith or deliberate tools of control? Perhaps both. To the faithful, they were sacred duties ensuring survival. To the priesthood, they reinforced power, binding kings to gods, communities to temples, and individuals to rituals they could not refuse. What we now call exploitation was in their world woven into the very fabric of religion. Worship and dominance became indistinguishable, sanctified by divine command. The paradox is stark. Mesopotamia, the cradle of civilization, also institutionalized some of history's most unsettling sacred practices. The temples that gave us writing and law also staged rituals that blurred the line between piety and abuse. To celebrate the myth of Mesopotamian progress without acknowledging these shadows is to accept half a truth. And yet, the story grows darker still when we consider the people who lived through these rituals. Behind every hymn praising divine union was a silent participant, a life reshaped by obligations never freely chosen. Their absence from history is not accidental. It is the direct result of deliberate erasure. To uncover the full truth, we must turn to those missing voices, the forgotten victims whose silence sustained the myth of temple purity. The forbidden rituals of Mesopotamian priests cannot be fully understood without acknowledging those who bore the cost. The kings were glorified. The priests recorded their authority in clay. But the men and women who enacted these rites left almost nothing in their own words. Their silence is not a mystery. It is the product of erasure. The victims of temple service, bound by vows or forced into roles, were celebrated as symbols but denied identity. They were remembered not as people, but as instruments of ritual. For women, the most common fate was dedication to the temple as brides of the god. On the surface, this sounded like an honor. Families presented daughters to temples as offerings, believing it secured divine favor. But for the girls themselves, it often meant a lifetime cut off from family, stripped of autonomy, and folded into roles where their bodies became extensions of ritual obligation. Hymns may exalt them as priestesses of Inanna or Ishtar, but their individuality vanished behind the role. They were living metaphors, never allowed to speak as themselves. Men, too, were caught in this system. Some served as sacred attendants, others as ritual surrogates enacting fertility dramas. In rare accounts, they appear dressed as brides of the goddess, forced into gender-fluid roles that unsettled later chroniclers. Their identities were erased just as surely as those of the women. What mattered was not the person, but the part they played in the ceremony. Once the ritual ended, they dissolved into silence. The silence was compounded by history itself. Later Mesopotamian cultures, embarrassed by the explicitness of Sumerian and Akkadian rituals, actively erased or sanitized them. Babylonians celebrated Ishtar's power but suppressed the sexualized details of her worship. Assyrians glorified military conquest while minimizing the temple's intimate practices. Even Hebrew prophets, condemning the whoredoms of Babylon, participated in rewriting history, reducing complex rituals to moral warnings while stripping away the voices of those involved. Each retelling buried the participants deeper, until only the priest's authority remained visible. Modern scholars repeated the pattern. When the first explicit tablets were unearthed in the 19th and early 20th centuries, translators often censored them. Erotic hymns were hidden in museum basements, marked as unfit for publication. Victims remained unnamed, their experiences dismissed as embarrassing curiosities rather than central truths of Mesopotamian culture. This academic silence preserved the myth of noble temples, while leaving the trauma of their servants unacknowledged. And yet, fragments of their suffering survive in cultural memory. Folk tales speak of women given to the gods, stories of brides sacrificed for harvest, whispers of temple servants who lived lives of loneliness. These echoes suggest that the rituals left scars that outlived their participants. Silence may have buried their voices, but it could not erase the unease they left behind. Collective memory preserved what official history erased. The tragedy lies in how the victims were framed. They were told their service was sacred, that to embody the goddess or the god was the highest calling. But honor without agency is not honor. What was celebrated as divine duty was for many a form of lifelong captivity. They were revered in public, yet privately controlled. Their humanity dissolved into ritual performance. Their silence is not absence, it is testimony, proof of how thoroughly power can erase the people it exploits. This pattern is not unique to Mesopotamia. Across history, priesthoods have sanctified silence, glorifying institutions while burying the lives of those sacrificed to maintain them. The Mesopotamian example simply reveals how deep these patterns go, all the way back to the first civilizations. Their temples were both the cradles of progress and the stage of exploitation. The glory of civilization was built on silence. As we move into the final section, we must ask, what legacy did this forbidden priesthood leave behind? How have its shadows shaped the way later cultures, and even our own, remember the origins of civilization? The legacy of Mesopotamian priests does not end with the ruins of their temples or the fragments of their hymns. It lingers in the myths we tell about civilization itself. Myths that celebrate progress while burying exploitation. Mesopotamia is hailed as the cradle of writing, law, and kingship. But hidden beneath those achievements lies another inheritance. The manipulation of sexuality as power, the silencing of victims, and the selective memory that preserved only what glorified the priesthood. To understand this legacy is to confront the uncomfortable truth that what we admire as humanity's beginnings was built on practices that later cultures deemed too scandalous to repeat. The priests institutionalized a model that has echoed across history, cloaking control in the language of divinity. By framing intimacy as ritual, they ensured obedience that no army could compel. Their system taught future civilizations that the body could be used as much as the sword to enforce authority. When Babylonians, Assyrians, and Persians inherited Mesopotamian traditions, they borrowed the structures while erasing the explicit rites. Yet the principle remained. Religious authority was inseparable from control over sexuality. Even when the rituals were forgotten, the pattern survived. Echoes can be found in the sacred unions of later Near Eastern cultures, in fertility festivals, across the Mediterranean, and in the gender-fluid attendance of Greco-Roman cults. The details changed, but the foundation was the same. Intimacy framed as sacred obligation, enacted to justify power. The shadow of Mesopotamian priesthood extended far beyond its borders, shaping how empires legitimized themselves for millennia. But perhaps the most enduring legacy lies in the silence. The victims of these rituals, women offered as brides of the god, men forced into roles they did not choose, were erased not only from their own society, but from history. Their voices were overwritten by hymns to Inanna and records kept by priests. Later civilizations compounded the silence, sanitizing the past to preserve a cleaner version of the first civilization. Even modern scholarship was slow to confront the explicit content of the tablets, preferring the myth of noble temples over the scandal of forbidden rites. This tradition of selective memory became part of civilization's DNA. We inherit not only Mesopotamia's inventions, but its silences. And that silence is powerful. It shapes how we see the past, how we define progress, how we separate glory from horror. To admire Mesopotamia's laws without acknowledging its forbidden practices is to accept only half the truth. The priests succeeded not only in orchestrating rituals, but in ensuring their secrets would be buried. Their greatest achievement was not just the control of bodies, but the control of memory. So what is the legacy of the forbidden priesthood? It is twofold. On one hand, it is the shadow beneath civilization's achievements, a reminder that progress has always been entangled with exploitation. On the other, it is a warning. Every culture has its secrets. Every institution, its silences. The Mesopotamian priests may be gone, but their pattern survives in how history is written, what is remembered, and what is erased. As we close, we return to the central question: how could the guardians of divine law preside over rituals so scandalous that later civilizations buried them? The answer is both simple and chilling, because power thrives in silence. The clay tablets that survived give us only fragments, but they are enough to remind us that the first temples were not only houses of worship, but houses of control. And if these forbidden truths remained hidden for 5,000 years, what other secrets of the ancient world still wait beneath the sands, too dangerous for history to tell?